Oh, he is. Good morning, sir. How are you?
Hey,
Good to see
Paul.
you.
Good morning. Great to see you, man.
Man, I was just reading some of those statistics on crime. I have another story here. Just let me just to give people an idea how out of control we are. And the other scary part of this, Mike, is that we're really not finding any solutions at all. We're going down. We're not going up. Atlanta suburb is aiming to secede from the Peach State's capital as violent crime plagues the city streets. Buckhead City Committee CEO Bill White was on Fox News, and he was discussing how crime has completely dismantled the city streets and the impact to defund the police movement on public safety. It's out of control. Once beautiful neighborhoods where there was a lot of gentrification, nobody could live there. I mean, they can't go out anymore. We are really feeling like this is a war zone. I don't say that lightly, especially given what you experience in a war zone, White told the co-host. So this is murder and mayhem. We're dealing with a mayor who voted to defund the police. It's obvious that police officers don't want to come to work for a mayor or a city that doesn't back them. So Buckhead wants to take things into their own hands, and according to the tracking, rape is up 80% as of June 18th. Burglaries are up 26%. Robberies are up another 8%. The wealthy Atlanta enclave has been fighting to become independent of the state's capital as rampant crime has plagued the neighborhood. We're short 180 police officers, and what are we supposed to do with that? They have no control over their city because they're in the capital confines. And I think that probably goes for a lot of state capitals, Mississippi inclusive.
Yeah, it reminds me of our capital city. I mean, a lot of things you said right there are almost directly in line with the city of Jackson. If you look at, you mentioned the mayor in Atlanta is in favor of defund the police. Our mayor is smart enough never to say the word defund, but if you look at his actions, if you look at his executive orders, if you look at what he has done to that police department and to our city, I mean, he has effectively defunded our police without, proactively or overtly saying defund. And another thing you mentioned, it was described by that individual as a war zone in Atlanta. I mean, think about this, Paul. What do we do when we have a war? What do we do when we are confronted as a nation with a war zone? We up our military. We up our forces. We up our resources. And frankly, when you talk about solutions, that is the solution to the problem here. We have to back the men in blue, and not just back them with our words. We have to put our money behind them. We have to hire more police officers to go out and do those jobs. If you look at this study done by the city of Jackson 20 years ago, they said that, the city of Jackson, in order to effectively fight and prevent and reduce violent crime, you need about 660 police officers in the city of Jackson. Today, we have about 250 police officers in the city of Jackson. We are woefully understaffed in the city of Jackson, and until we have real leadership, until we have people who decide that it is a priority to staff up the police department, to have the back of our men and women in blue, nothing's going to change.
Well, that has to change with the people voting the same people in, one way or the other. I mean, if they're not smart enough to see this, where do you go from there? I mean, you can't take over like a bad school, a city. And again, and I mentioned and tweeted this out a little bit earlier, when National gets this, they're not going to be blaming it on Democrat mayors. They're going to be blaming it on Republican leadership in the state of Mississippi. And that's the way they'll transfer this out, use it. But every single day, we get, let's see, in the stack today, the body discovered on Woodall Drive earlier this month has been identified. Jackson Police Department identified the victim, 17-year-old Michael Cage, shot to death, found in a ditch. Police asked for help in identifying the body, and police asked that any call Crime Stoppers. If you have a carjacking, a purse snatching, or something like that, your chances of actually getting police attention when the bulletin board is full of murderers is not very good.
Well, and just as I said, just with the number of police officers, they can't be everywhere all the time. And, if you look at, the Gallo poll did a study about 2 years ago, and it looked at when all the defund police movement was big and going on, and it found that those individuals in the poor areas of the inner city and frankly, African-American individuals said that they wanted the police department to be at or more than the levels that they currently had. 80% said that they wanted at or more than the current levels of police department. So, to your point, the city of Jackson, the Jackson residents themselves have to decide that they want to change. But until they make a change, nothing is going to change in the city of Jackson.
Well, let me ask you this, though. If you were put in charge of that and the Jackson mayor said, all right, Mike, you're in charge, with those 220, will they be utilized differently in putting wokeism aside to do what you can legally do under the Constitution of this country? Are we doing all of that? Or are we just not? We're not doing that.
Well, if I was put in charge of the city of Jackson's police department, the first thing I would do is I would take back some of the executive orders the mayor put into place. One, he put into place that police officers cannot pursue criminals in the city of Jackson. What do you think that does to the psyche of criminals?
Absolutely.
If police officers can't pursue them, what does that do to the law-abiding citizens of Jackson? They don't want to come out of their houses if they know the police aren't going to chase criminals. Another executive order he instituted was after a police officer has been involved in a shooting, whether it was justified or not, the mayor's policy is to release that police officer's name within 72 hours of that officer-involved shooting. Whether he's had due process, whether his family might be in jeopardy, it doesn't matter. The mayor, in his woke policies, wants to get that police officer's name out there. So you have to repeal a lot of these things that have been put in place that have just completely demoralized the police department in the city of Jackson. If you start doing that, and you start, again, you have to do a wholesale review of the budget of Jackson. You have to do a wholesale review of the police department to see, do we have too much administrative salaries that could be put on the streets? You got to put officers back on the streets patrolling. When I talk to individual officers in the city of Jackson, they want to do the right thing. They want to make their city better, but we've got to give them the backup and the support to make that happen.
But every single, to a man or woman, if they got a better job offer from a nearby city, they would take it immediately.
That's right, and it comes back to leadership.
I'm sorry to say that, but
it comes back to leadership. If you're a leader, if you're mayor, if you're whoever's in charge does not have your back, does not have the best interest of the city and its residents in its forefront, then it's hard for a police officer to do their job. And that's what we're seeing right now in the city of Jackson.
Our friend George Flagg, mayor of Vicksburg, imposed a curfew. It was last week, a couple of weeks ago. And the crime ticked up a little bit, and he put a curfew in. And I've heard some people say curfews don't work. And I'm thinking, well, it couldn't hurt as far as a curfew for teenagers up to 17, 18 years old, unless you do have a viable excuse.
Right.
But has he ever done that?
Not that I know of.
Recently?
I think maybe during COVID, the mayor tried to institute a curfew, just like the mayor tried to outlaw, the possession of firearms during COVID as well. So I don't put too much stock in what the mayor does in the city of Jackson. But, a curfew might be something to look at if you only apply it to minors. Because sadly, we do have a number of minors who are unsupervised, who just have no parental guidance in the city of Jackson. And, what we see, you saw this in the Mudbugs shooting, you see this in shootings that are reported day after day. A lot of the shooters are under the age of 18. And sadly, in the federal system, in the U.S. Attorney's Office where I used to be, we don't have much jurisdiction, or we can't, because of the Department of Justice policies, really do much with a minor in the federal system.
And what happens to them after that? I mean, because this brings in the topic of Andy Gibson talking about the holding centers, which apparently they need more in the city of Jackson anyway. But how important are they in the scheme of things of getting this under control?
Well, I think what Andy's doing, what a lot of the state leaders are doing, as you mentioned, a lot of the Republican leaders are trying to find solutions, and they're bringing folks to the table to discuss these, Democrats, Republicans, independent, whatever. But, another issue that needs to be addressed in the city of Jackson is really the lack of a backbone, I would say, in our local judiciary. I saw it time after time after time again as U.S. attorney when the local Jackson Police Department would arrest somebody, take them, district attorney would try to prosecute them, take them to the local judge there in Jackson, and they're released back on the street. In fact, I had a police officer right after I became U.S. attorney said, Mike, here's the problem we have is I arrest the same individual over and over and over again, and while I have him in handcuffs, he's laughing at me because he knows he's going to be back on the street before I have my paperwork processed.
It's 2022. It's not like we haven't had time to work this out. We should know exactly what to do by now, but we're not doing it. There was a couple of other things I want to touch base on this one. More with Mike Hurst coming up next. I see. Continuing our conversation with a former U.S. Attorney for the Southern District, Mike Hurst. When you look at all that we can do, and you see some things going on, and of course, they're posted within 15 minutes and sometimes within live action on Facebook of these snatch and grabs. Thankfully, that hasn't been something that's taken hold in our state, and I think the Castle Law is probably one of the reasons for that. But broad daylight, you will have some people attacking drivers, just like a bunch of animals. You have people walking up and just cold cocking somebody, and you know in your heart that most of these people are not even investigated and probably not brought to justice. But do a lot of these states not have the Castle Law?
I don't know what the percentage is of states who have the Castle Law. I think it is primarily situated in the southern United States, as you would expect, and maybe even in the western United States. But I know we do. I know it's been on the books for a number of years now. And frankly, Paul, when I was U.S. Attorney, I would go to town hall meetings around the city of Jackson, and I was frankly shocked that I would hear grandmothers who were raising their grandkids in their house and complaining about the Jackson Police Department would not respond to 911 calls that they made, and they said in these public town hall meetings that they did something they never thought they would ever do, and that is they went out and buy a firearm for their protection. And so it got me to thinking, and I talked with a number of individuals before I left the U.S. Attorney's Office, but why don't we do more to help these grandmothers, these aunts, these single moms, these individuals who are trying to make it in the city of Jackson? Why don't we do more to help them learn more about firearms, to be trained properly in firearms, to know how to handle firearms, how to protect firearms, and frankly, to be able to protect themselves and their families? Because at the end of the day, that's what we all want, no matter if we're Republican, Democrat, black, white, whatever. We want our families and our kids to be safe. And, I think more needs to be done in terms of education and, frankly, just arming our citizens.
I would think that would be a good idea on a small number of them, but when grandmothers are dealing with a 13-year-old out-of-control child, that's a dangerous.
Well, that's a different situation. Absolutely,
it really is.
Yeah.
If they're living alone, they ought to be able to protect themselves, and I think it's a very, very, very good idea. I remember having numerous conversations, and one not too long ago with Justice Randolph. And he's trying to get, the drug courts going, the youth courts and things such as that. And sometimes has a very difficult time getting the ear of enough legislators. And I do not understand why.
Well, I will tell you, my wife came up with a great idea a few months ago. And, we have drug courts, as you mentioned. We have, veterans courts. Some states have mental health courts. She said, we have an epidemic of violent crime in the city of Jackson. We have an issue where the judges are not adequately addressing it, taking violent criminals off our streets as they're required to do by law, and to keep people safe until they have their day in court. And she said, why don't we come up with an idea like a violent crime court? You take these issues of just the violent criminals, you take them to a special court where they will get special consideration, where the detention laws and our bond laws will actually be enforced, and they will be detained, and then they will have their rights to a speedy trial and be put into court. In the federal system, once you come into court, once you are arraigned on charges, you have 70 days until you have your trial. I mean, we move them quickly in the federal system, and I understand the locals are really overrun with cases, but I don't see why we couldn't do something similar to that and try to maybe specialize these types of cases where we have violent criminals who are terrorizing our city. Because at the end of the day, the studies show that, most of the violent crime that happens in cities all throughout the nation are really composed of just a small group, a small number of individuals that keep doing this over and over and over again.
When the police do not make an arrest, that person's going to be on the street. If they do make an arrest and let them go, they're still back on the street. And sometimes they've committed 2, 3, 4, 5 felonies or more, and sometimes they've killed more than one person before they actually wind up in prison.
Right.
And I try to get a picture on exactly what do you do with the 16-year-old who's pulling the trigger and actually shooting people what do you do with that 16-year-old? Do we have the facilities to do that?
I don't know the answer to that. I think we do have the facilities. I do think we have the facilities. I think what we don't have is...
I ask about those facilities, and many of them say they're overcrowded, they're not staffed. Whose jurisdictions are they under?
Well, a perfect example is this: is the shooter at the Mudbug Festival. He was 15 years old. Before he committed that shooting at the Mudbug Festival, he had, according to news reports, he had been arrested 3 or 4 times for carjacking, for armed carjacking. Now, why he was still on the streets, why he was not in some type of youth detention facility, it's anybody's guess. But at the same time, you have to wonder what the judges are thinking or doing when a kid puts a gun in someone's face, steals their car, and the judge puts them back on the street.
Well, all of this has to do with the people that we elect one way or the other, and if the judges are appointed, they are appointed by elected officials. So if we don't straighten that out and become better informed, and I'm as I said the other day, I'm preaching to the choir, this audience, because they are the most informed. They are the most likely to vote. So I'm not getting it to the right ears, and I understand that. Let's switch over real quickly.
Before we move from that, one more thing I would mention to you. There are a number of nonprofits in town. I'm involved in one called Unite Mississippi. We're trying to bring everyone of different races, of different genders, of different religions together. And one thing we've been doing is going into the youth detention facilities and trying to mentor these young men who have made some very huge, very life-changing mistakes. And what I would just encourage our listeners is we need to step up and we need to do this. We need to get involved with nonprofits that go into these prisons, go into these youth detention facilities, and try to make a difference of these men or these young kids while they're there before they get let back out on the street.
Sounds like a little like Mission, Mississippi.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right, let's switch over to the ruling by the Supreme Court. What do you think?
Oh, my goodness. Which one, Paul? Last week was amazing. I mean, we did have the Dobbs opinion on the abortion, but we also had the opinion on the Second Amendment. We had 2 opinions on the First Amendment's free exercise of religion. I mean, last week was one of the most, in my opinion, one of the most consequential weeks in legal history in America. So, but to your question, to Dobbs first, I think the court got it exactly right. The court got it how Roe v. Wade should have been decided 50 years ago, and that is abortion is not in our Constitution. And rather than enshrine it by this crazy decision in Roe, it's the poster child for judicial activism, if you would, and later Casey in 1992. What the court here in Dobbs did was just say, hey, it's not in our Constitution, and it's not a fundamental constitutional right. Therefore, you people are given that issue back. You are allowed by your representatives to make that decision for yourselves. And I understand there's a lot of consternation about that decision, but at the same time, it puts the decision back in the hands and the will of the people, which is what I thought we as a representative democracy is we're supposed to be for.
It is a little bit disappointing to see all of the companies, the big companies out there, from some of the major companies, I'm not going to start naming them, saying, look, if you can't get abortion in your state, we'll help you. Come to our state and get an abortion. We'll be a killing state. Come over here. And, of course, that's going to apply to a lot of states in the east, the northeast, and the left coast as well. But it's a little bit disappointing to see that. And I mentioned this earlier this morning. It's almost like they're putting it out like pregnancy is not a choice. And I'm not talking about rape, and I'm not talking about the mother's health. I think we put both those things in there, and I'm quite comfortable with what we have in our abortion law and with those 2 exclusions. But it's almost like it's getting COVID or monkeypox or something that, my God, all of these teenagers now are going to catch pregnancy, and what are they going to do?
Right.
Well, make a responsible decision.
Right.
And there are more ways to avoid that today than ever before, even if you do decide to have sex every night.
Yeah, and I think we also have to put a human face on it, because that's what we're talking about here. It's not abortion. It's not fetuses. We're talking about human beings. We're talking about babies. And, the last numbers I saw were 630,000 abortions per year. 630,000 abortions per year. 3,500 per year just in Mississippi, which equals about 67 abortions a week. I mean, if we as a society cannot value life at the beginning stages, it's hard for me to see how we value it at any stage.
What would happen if a white Republican would say, the vast majority of those are black people, and look at the crime level. Why should we get involved?
Well,
that would be one of the most racist things you could possibly say.
Well,
and if that's the case, why the hell are Republicans being knocked down by Democrats on this?
Well, and Justice Alito,
an oddity.
Justice Alito addressed that issue, that disparate impact issue for sure.
I want to touch on that. We'll give you the final segment coming up in a moment. All right, a little redundancy there, but it never hurts. Good morning, my friends. How are you? Live from the Trustmark Studios, Mike Hurst, final segment here. By the way, I have one audio bite that and I was going to play it during the last touch of the subject here, from a Congressman Jamal Bowman, and just listen to this one.
Under federal law, a person can buy a rifle at 18, but they cannot buy alcohol until they're 21. Do you think the drinking age should be lowered to 18?
No. I think the law to buy a rifle should be raised to 25, and I think they should actually be banned, personally.
All right, thank you, Congressman.
Yeah, Congressman Jamal Bowman wants all rifles banned. So,
where is he from, Paul?
I think he's from Georgia, but I'm not sure where he's from.
He wouldn't last very long in Mississippi.
No, he wouldn't. I worry about the next generation. We're real close. I know we're not 50-50 yet. We probably are 45% as far as these kooks out there, but the next generation, it's the same thing as far as the abortion thing. And I worry that even though we stop this, it's going to be much like marijuana, where if you ask Mike Hurst 15, 20 years ago, will we actually legalize marijuana by a majority vote in the state of Mississippi? If we do away with abortion 15 or 20 years from now, and I don't think it'd take that long, I think it's probably going to be 10 years, it'll be on a referendum and an initiative somewhere to make it more flexible, and then we do the same thing. It's just the window of opportunity for the innocent to be born. It will not last that long, I fear. But your final thoughts, sir?
Yeah, a lot of thoughts, Paul. As I mentioned, this Dobbs decision, I mean, people will remember where they were when this case came down. They will remember what they did. But also, I would point your listeners back to a couple of other decisions. You know, the Supreme Court decided the New York State Rifle and Pistol Association. That's a mouthful, but basically it's the biggest Second Amendment case they've decided in over 10 years. And it basically said that the Second Amendment means what it says, that we have a right to defend ourselves outside of the home with firearms. And in that case, New York tried to restrict, licenses for gun ownership and say that you had to have specific reasons, and the state had to approve that, which is just, that's crazy for us here in Mississippi. But, this happens all throughout the United States. So that was a huge win for us as a people, I think. And the other two cases I'll mention to you real briefly was a case in Maine that involved the First Amendment free exercise. Basically, it was Maine allowed parents to send their kids to public or private schools if there was no public school in the area, and they would pay for that. But Maine they prohibited the private schools from being religious-type schools. And the Supreme Court said that's just flat-out discrimination on the state's part. You can't say we'll give state money to public and private schools, but those private schools can't be religious affiliated. And Supreme Court, over the last probably 6, 7, 8 years, have really put some teeth back into the First Amendment. And the last one I'll mention to you is the one that a lot of your listeners know about, Coach Joe Kennedy out in Washington State, who, again, it's crazy facts, but all he did was after each game, after, he was allowed to make personal phone calls or, check his Twitter account or whatever, when he was not doing his role as a coach, as an employee of the state, he would just simply walk out to the midfield on the football field by himself, kneel down and pray for 30 seconds. Yeah. And he got fired for that. And so the Supreme Court upheld his right, again, under the First Amendment, free exercise of religion, to be able to do that. And again, this Supreme Court is actually putting some common sense back into our Constitution, actually, reading the Constitution for what it says and looking into the histories and traditions of our country to interpret the Constitution. And I think,
how do you think that's going to change with the announcement of Justice Breyer, saying that he's going to retire?
Well, in about 3 hours, Justice Breyer will have retired, and we're going to have a new Supreme Court justice on the I think it's not going to change because right now Breyer was the dean of the quote-unquote Democratic justices on the Supreme Court, and I think what we'll see from here henceforth going forward is continuation of either 6-3 opinions in the favor of the Republican-nominated justices, or even, like we saw in Dobbs, a 5-4 decision. Chief Justice Roberts was not on the side of the clear majority in Dobbs. He didn't want to get rid of Roe v. Wade or Casey. And so I think right now, for whatever my friends who are never Trumpers, who did not like President Trump, for whatever you can say about President Trump, the fact that he has remolded and reshaped our United States Supreme Court is going to have the biggest and most lasting effect on all of our lives for the rest of the time that we live.
And many other justices throughout the system across this country. And not only that, had he won a second term, 2 more conservative justices would have put the Democrat Party out of business, and they knew that. Justice Sotomayor had a great line on Clarence Thomas. And I don't know if you've heard this, but by the time you leave, get back in your car, I'll have a chance to play this, and I want you to hear it. But it's Sotomayor on her thoughts on Clarence Thomas. When we come back in the next hour, we'll play it as an opening, too, before we get to lottery. Back with more next.